coming. Just to give you a little background, this research is still in progress. We are collecting data through the end of December, and it primarily started out as a student-faculty research project. But my initial degree is in English literature, so I've always been a fan of reading and having that to be a really large part of my life. I needed to get a real job at one point in my life, though, so I went back and I got a degree in speech-language pathology, communication disorders. So I was listening to NPR one morning on my way here and heard a story about some research that had just been published up in New York that was talking about the use of fiction to increase empathy. And so I started thinking, wow, how could I bring that into my world? And so that's kind of the root, the origin of where this research came from. And Dr. Thistle here is also helping me with this research. So she came from moral support. So just to start, I think autism is a word that everybody hears, but I didn't want to assume knowledge, so I thought I would just very briefly talk to you about what we know about autism currently. And autism affects 1 in 68 children. Now that is not worldwide, and I've got a photo here in just a minute to show that. But in the United States, it's currently 1 in 68, and mostly boys, 1 in 42 boys. It is the fastest growing developmental disorder currently in the United States. And at the present time, there's no known, there's not a biological marker that we're aware of for detection. And we have a lot of interventions, but there's actually no cure. So here are some slides that I thought were really interesting. The one on your left is from the CDC, and that's basically just telling you, showing you what I said about the 1 in 68. What is interesting is just 7 years ago it was 1 in 150. Now they have some reasons for that, and they think a lot of it has to do with increased diagnostic markers. But what I thought was really interesting was this over here. And this is also based on CDC information, which shows that in Western Europe and North America, clearly we're diagnosing at a much higher rate than other parts of the world. I thought it was interesting that Scandinavia gets its own little column there, and they had a couple of years of high diagnosis and then nothing. Mostly I included that because I thought it was really interesting, not that it has a whole lot to do with my study, but I thought it was interesting and worthy of conversation at some point. So the primary symptoms for autism, we have social interaction difficulties, which is where we as speech-language pathologists typically spend most of our time, and the communication challenges that children have. And there's a wide range of these. As it says with the spectrum, you have children and adults that are very, very high functioning that, you know, maybe 20 years ago we would have just thought they were kind of the quirky kids in the class, all the way to students who are completely nonverbal. My experience clinically working with children with autism is primarily at the middle and the high school age group, and I had children on that entire end of the spectrum. I had a large group of children that were in middle school that were completely nonverbal, and then I had some in middle and high school that were very high functioning academically, and we knew what was going on. We just had to prepare them for certain things throughout the day, but for the most part they were able to blend in seamlessly with their peers. Theory of mind is something also that affects people on the autism spectrum. And theory of mind is what we call that ability to take the perspective of someone else. And it is something that develops gradually through the preschool years. So what I have here is, this is one of our coworkers, Becca Jarzinski. And Becca has done a fabulous job of getting videos for us from her children as they have grown up. And this is her daughter when she was 3 years old. And so one of the things that we do to test theory of mind is something called a Sally Ann task. All right, so what the Sally Ann task is, and at Cassia's age, she was not expected to be successful with this task. But you see there are 2 cups here. And what they do is they introduce her to their 2 dolls. So we have Sally Ann, and then we have another little doll. I guess one is Sally, one is Ann, actually. So there we go. I'm from the South. Double names actually make sense to me. So what they do is they hide, Sally has some money. So they put it under a cup, and Cassia sees it being put under the cup, and then Sally goes to school. And then while she's gone, Anne, the little trickster doll, comes around and she moves the money. And she takes the money from this cup and she puts it under this cup. So now Cassia knows where it is, but clearly Sally was not there. So the task is, when Sally comes back, where does Cassia think she's going to look for her money? Is it going to be where she last saw it, or is it going to be where Cassia now knows the money is? So if a child has developed theory of mind, they're going to be successful with this task. They're going to understand that they have information that the other person does not have. And in this case, because Cassia is only 3, she says that she's going to look where the money was moved to. So that's our theory of mind task. And we also have a video of her at 5 where she is successful with this task. So theory of mind is something that people with autism often struggle with. And theory of mind is kind of that broader term that then leads us into empathy. So we have a couple of different types of empathy when we're talking about the development of it. So we have affective empathy. And this is that reaction that we have, that automatic reaction to what somebody else is feeling. When you're talking to a friend and they're really upset and you start to become upset with them, that's because you are demonstrating affective empathy. The other one is cognitive empathy, and that is our ability, and it's closer to the theory of mind, of that ability to identify what somebody else might be thinking, that ability to take that other person's perspective. So we have seen studies that have been done that show that these are skills that can be improved. There's one study that they did with children that they introduced acting, because when you're acting, you take somebody else's perspective. So through this practice for a year of engaging these children in the community theater, they were able to improve their empathy skills, and there are a couple of different measures of that. The one that I came back to was fiction, because fiction was also shown to increase empathy. And it wasn't just any fiction. They did, the initial study that they were talking about were by some researchers, Kidd and Castano, and they initially looked at the difference between fiction and nonfiction to see if there were differences and measures of empathy after people were asked to read these two things. And in that first study, they showed that people who had been exposed to the fiction afterwards did better on measures of empathy than the people who had read nonfiction. So then they looked, I should probably go ahead. So then they took that a little bit farther, and they said, well, let's look at fiction, both popular fiction and literary fiction. And then they had a whole discussion about what exactly is literary fiction and why would that make a difference as opposed to like your bestseller romance or mystery novels. And they said one of the differences with literary fiction, and they used these by looking at book that win the Book of the Year awards and some of the other channels through there. And they said when you're reading fiction, you are exposed to character development in a way that you're not when you're interacting with somebody face to face. That, you know, when I'm talking to Jen and I'm having to read her emotions, I'm having to try to figure out why she's doing what she's doing. But if I'm reading a book that has well-developed characters, that is made explicit for me. So the theory was that people who read fiction develop better senses of empathy because those internally hidden emotions and thoughts are now made explicit. And so it used to be that you think somebody had their nose in a book, they're missing out on the wide world, whereas this research is now showing, or at least implying, that when you're engaged in the book and you're engaged with the characters, you're actually learning more about the world than if you're not, if that is something that you really need because you're not figuring it out on your own. The reason this is because of something called transportation. So think about the last time you read a really good book and the world just kind of went away. I was that kid. I would read a book and it didn't matter what my parents were watching on TV or what was going on around me. It was gone. I was completely engaged with the book. these characters become real. And my husband, to this day, he says, you know, Harry Potter is real. We're muggles, so we don't know, but, you know, let's go read the next documentary. Clearly he's teasing. But, you know, reading that sort of novel where you connect with characters like that, it allows you to have emotions and feelings that you might not have in a day-to-day experience. So our questions for the research, initially we were just going to go ahead and jump right into an intervention study and try to replicate what had been done. But then I started thinking, you know, first we need to ask if people with autism who have documented lower levels of empathy and difficulties with their theory of mind, do they even experience this transportation when they're reading? So that was kind of the question we ended up backing up to. So we want to know, do they read fiction at the same rate as people without autism, or do they read more nonfiction? Because just working with people with autism, that was a real question. What are they drawn to? Are they drawn to more of the kind of engineering sort of books, or do they still read fiction? And if so, when they read that fiction, do they have the same experiences that we have? So what we did is, like I said, we're still collecting data, so this is all very preliminary. We made it 18 through adult, and what I thought also might be interesting was to look at age differences in reading fiction. And I developed that just by talking to my students who are helping me with this project, who are excellent students, they're seniors, and neither one of them considered themselves a reader, which was, I thought, interesting. So it is what it is, I guess. So what we ended up doing is, for this presentation, is we pulled out the applicants that we have. So currently we actually have 16 students with autism. We had one who took the survey yesterday, so they're not included in this. And then we matched them with male peers. The reason we narrowed it down to males is let me go on, let me show you. So this is part of what we did. These are it's just sample questions. First, we want to know, do you consider yourself a reader? And if they said yes, then we asked, well, what sort of things do you read? And we had a list for them to choose from. And depending on the answers to that, if they said, no, I'm not a reader, or if I'm a reader but I only read nonfiction, then they basically were taken to the end of the study, because we really are looking at those people who read fiction. So if they said, yes, they're a reader, yes, they read fiction, then we went into a section of the survey where we looked at that transportation. And my students looked at some of the previous research that had been done and pulled some questions that had been used in the past. So fiction affects me emotionally, and things like that. One of the other things we did, and this was reading the mind and the eyes, and this was why we chose the male, this is a test of empathy. So you are shown a picture of just somebody's eyes, and then you're given 4 choices of how they're feeling. This study has been used multiple times and has a lot of validity behind it, but what it has also shown is that there's a statistical difference between how, in neurotypical individuals, females tend to perform better on this task than males, and people with autism tend to perform significantly worse, I guess, than neurotypicals. The average range is 22 to 30, and so they're still within that average range, but they're on a little bit lower end of the range. So that's why we decided to just look at males, so that we could, even though most of our respondents were actually females, so it's a relatively long survey. We've been pleased that we've had as many participants complete it as we have, because there are, I think, 30 of these pictures. And one of the questions that my students had when they started taking them is they didn't know what the vocabulary was. So they had a hard time when they were taking it, because they had to stop and look up the vocabulary. So we've also included definitions for the different terms in there. That was an original part of the reading the mind and the eyes that Baron Cohen developed. So our preliminary results are that there's really not much of a difference. That other than the reading the mind and the eyes, which is consistent with past studies, that So this first one is on average, how many hours per week do you read for work or educational purposes? So this group of numbers over here are are people with autism, and here are neurotypicals. They read, well, one of the differences is that people with autism read less than people with neurotypicals when we're talking about work. But when we're talking about pleasure, it evens out. So that might have more of an effect of their vocation, whether they're in school. But when it was interesting, but I'm not really sure. We really don't know what to make of all of this quite yet. And then, do you consider yourself a reader? The yes for the ASD and no for neurotypicals. That I thought was really interesting. I didn't expect that. I didn't expect our people, our individuals with autism, to report higher levels of being a reader than our students or the individuals without autism. And then these are some of the other questions that we asked. This was that measure of transportation. So while while I'm reading, I feel mentally involved in the story. Excuse me. So while reading, I have a hard time putting down books. So basically we want to look at this column compared to this column. And our individuals with autism were reporting higher levels of transportation at this point. We haven't run the numbers, so I don't know if it's a statistically significant difference, but just kind of eyeballing it, it does look like they're reporting equal, if not a little bit higher numbers than our neurotypicals. So our implications, the reason I wanted to know this was because I wanted to know if this could be a viable intervention. Because as I said at the very beginning, we don't have a lot of research-based intervention techniques with people with autism to work on their theory of mind and work on those social deficits they have that they find to impact them the most throughout their life. So one of the things I want to know is if they experience transportation so that we can maybe use this as an intervention technique. And they are reporting that they do. So the second implication is that maybe we can incorporate fiction, as I said, into some intervention technique with our individuals with autism. And so our next step after we finish collecting all of this data and analyzing it is to then look to see if we can set up an intervention study, probably with our college-age students, going back to that original study that I heard about where they looked at the use of popular fiction and literary fiction and no fiction, and using that to start looking at it as an intervention for our individuals with autism. Are there any questions? Yes?
Who are the 16 or 15 people now then? Are they people who completed the survey?
They have completed the survey. Our survey is through Qualtrics and everything is anonymous. So once they complete it, we don't know. So we have information about their age, their gender, we have family income. So we've asked a lot of information that we could go back and potentially look to see if there's an age difference, to see if there's a difference in socioeconomic status. So what we've been able to do is go back into the Qualtrics and just tease it out, just the people who answered at the very last question, because we didn't want to have any preconceived ideas, is do you have a diagnosis of autism? So that's how we are. So it's up to self-disclosure. So there's a possibility that people who are taking it are not self-disclosing that. But that is what we've done to try to give ourselves a corpus that we can work with.
Do you have any idea where they are with their education once they've completed it?
We do. We haven't looked at that quite yet did you remember looking?
Closely.
We haven't looked at that closely, but that is one of the questions we ask. So we ask, what is their level of education? Most of them looking at it, and we got a lot of we use the SONA on campus, so we have a lot of females college age as our typical responders, and then I think most of our people with ASD were also mostly, they appear to be the student range, age range.
It's interesting to me because we send it out to 16 people.
Oh, really?
And whenever we send out a survey, we often get responses from our students with on the spectrum that say things like, you can give some examples too, but we'll get a comment back about a wording in the survey or something that went wrong in the survey. And they have no trouble telling us who they are. They'll email us right away. I did the survey and this is what's wrong with it, or whatever. So I think a lot of them respond to the surveys we send from the disability office.
I know that we have a couple of different groups that we work with over in our clinic, adult social groups, and I know some of them did it, but I think there was only 4 or 5 in that group. Carly, one of my students, she has really gone above and beyond trying to recruit, so we've used social media. We contacted Autism Speaks, which is the largest autism advocacy group in the United States. They have a whole research page, so we've put it on there. I think that the last one we got, it was through there. I had got an email from a brother with that link asking if his brother could participate, and I said yes. So I know we've got at least one from Autism Speaks. But they've used Facebook, they put it through there, they've called groups, and they have really spent a lot of time trying to get people to take the survey. But like I said, it's a pretty long survey. There's also, and I didn't mention it earlier, something called an author recognition test. So you go through, and if you say that you're a reader, say that you read fiction, then you answer those transportation questions. Then the next part is you're given a list of authors, both real authors and not real authors. And you have to check the ones that you think are authors. And that has been used in the past to correlate people who report being readers. Do they typically do better on this, with the idea that even if you haven't read a work by this particular author, if you spend time around books, if you spend time walking through a bookstore or in a library, you're going to recognize some of the names. So that's been used several times in the past. So we went ahead and we put that in there. And then after that, they have the reading the mind and the eyes test, which it's free source. So if you are interested in taking it, when I first heard about this, I went on, you Google it and you come up and you can take it yourself. My husband's very proud. He did better than I did on it. So I said, well, you don't fall into the typical category there, but he did do better. So it's really interesting, but there's a lot of it. And that was one of our original concerns, is this going to be too long? But we really wanted to have the answers to these questions, so we thought we would try it. So, did you have a question?
Yeah, no, it had to do with the school was surveyed, which I guess mostly students.
I think they ended up being mostly students. I know, like, every week Carly would put it on her Facebook page one day, and then the next week Emma would, and they would do it different times a day. I put it on my Facebook page, so I went to all of my friends here and in Cincinnati who are SLPs or might be working at the university level. So they really, I think social media, I get the sense, is where and the Sona research is where we got, because that ended up having to close. We got as soon as it went on Sona, where they could potentially get, and I didn't know what this was before this, but Sona is through the psychology department, where students can engage in research and then potentially get credit for doing it in their psychology classes. So we used that and got a lot of responses. And we had to actually close that down because we were hoping, pie in the sky, we were hoping to get 100 of each group. We haven't. Looking at the research that has been done, this is actually a pretty typical number for some of the other research, is that they have much higher levels of clearly the neurotypicals than people with autism. So, I mean, these are self-selected individuals too. So it might be that people get on there, and if they're not a reader and they see the name of the study, they might not even bother to look at it. So that's a potential limitation right there, is that we might not be getting a very good sampling or a very typical sampling because of the nature of how this is done.
Well, we had also sent it from our office to Stout, CBTC, and UW Barron County. But another thing might be, our office, we're able to divide up by disability because we sort, so we could sort it and send it that way, and I don't know if other people have difficulty, just, taking out just that population in a really easy manner. So that might keep people too from institutional, and I know CBTC wrote back to us and they needed permission, Carly to resend some things to them to go through their research department there, so.
Yeah, they put flyers up. She had a friend in the graphic art department who helped her create the flyers, so it'd be really interesting. And
The flyers are really nice. They're all
do a
over
nice
around
job.
our office, so people can have family or other people they know to refer them to it. So are you going to have it up all semester then?
Yes, through the end of, they are both seniors and they are graduating, so we had to have a time where they could close it and put it together and do the circa presentation. So we figured by the end of December. One of the things they'll also be doing in February through our department, we have pro seminars where we have people come in and speak, and we always try to showcase research that our students are doing. So in February, Carly and Emma will actually be taking this same presentation, expanding it to about a 2.5-hour presentation, and at that point we'll have all of our data, so they'll have analyzed everything and they'll be presenting it at one of our pro sems in February, which will probably be over in HSS. So I'm excited for them. They've worked really hard on this, and I love the idea. I love the thought that reading a book can help us be better social people, and so I find the research actually fascinating. Yes?
The reading in the mind and the eyes study, that was part of your survey?
It was our measure of empathy, because we wanted to look at people who are reporting being readers and to see if it was consistent with what's been done in the past. That assessment has been done with people with autism many, many times. So we just wanted to make sure that the group of people with autism that we got that it was going to be consistent with what they have found with larger studies.
Was that the point where you said there wasn't a big difference? Or was that in terms of the
I don't know if it's a statistically significant difference yet. I don't think it is. We just have so few. But it was consistent with previous research that our people who had identified as having autism were a couple of points lower on that scale overall than our neurotypical males, which their numbers fell very much in line with the research done by Baron Cohen. And he had like 300 people. So, yes?
The hypothesis is that reading fiction will increase empathy.
Mm-hmm.
Has there been previous studies that have shown that folks that tend to lack empathy are drawn to nonfiction versus people that have empathy are drawn to fiction?
I don't know. That's a good question. I think that the research that has been done has looked at random sampling. I know with the kid in Castano, theirs was an online survey, so they had used students in their courses. They're in psychology, I believe, and they sent it out random sampling to people who some were assigned not to read anything, some were assigned to read nonfiction, some were assigned to read fiction, and even with that, so they did the test before they had them read these different measures, and then they retested them, and even with that group of people who weren't reporting one way or the other, there was a significant difference of people who read the fiction over the people who read nothing or the nonfiction. So there's a lot with the neurotypical population looking at that transportation and the empathy. I was reading recently that there are some programs that are starting to use it, like having doctors read more to try to increase empathy. I don't know what research supports that, but I know that it is, and this has become kind of a popular social media topic. I've seen the study that I originally based this off of. I've heard it talked about in different places with more kind of layperson sort of terminology, but when you start listening to it, and it pops up on Facebook on a pretty regular basis, and I'm like, oh wait, I bet that's my same study, and I click on it, and it is. So it's, I don't know, I think it's kind of a really interesting place to go in a world that seems to be going away from reading.
Just to the latter part of there are medical humanities programs, either as a segment of medical schools, or there are even independent graduate programs in medical humanities, which is just to address the issue you just identified. So it's beginning to permeate through the otherwise very technologically oriented healthcare system. I can't remember whether there's a program in Wisconsin at Madison or at MCW in Milwaukee on that, but just that notion that being technically proficient doesn't necessarily make you a good physician or healthcare provider of any sort if you can't identify with your patient and who they are.
Yeah, we talk a lot about clinical disposition over in communication disorders, and with that we tell our students it's not all about your grades. You have to have the skills to work with individuals, and that's why we have a counseling class at the graduate level. But I think what struck me most about this original study was that idea that when you're reading a novel, you get inside the character's head. So when we're teaching comprehension strategies to children and trying to teach them how to understand, we use think-alouds a lot, where we tell the teachers and the therapists, make your thinking explicit, because that's how the kids are going to learn those metacognitive skills, is by you showing them yours. And this was very much along that same vein, that as you're reading these more literary novels that have really deep character descriptions, and you get inside their head and hear their thought process and hear that problem solving and hear, okay, well, this is what they were thinking, and then this is what they did. So so even somebody who doesn't have that natural affective empathy, if they are the more critical kind of logic-based, they can still piece that together. When I was last year, when Temple Grandin came to campus, I don't know how many of you went to see her, but one of the things that she said that has stuck with me is, she's been speaking forever. And she said, she puts jokes in her talks, not because she has any idea why people think that they're funny, but she's been told that people think these jokes are funny, so she puts them in there for humor. And that's her very analytical brain saying, I don't get this, but I know that if I do this, it's going to have this consequence. And so that kind of goes back to the same thought, that if we're reading fiction and we're getting inside characters' minds, even if we don't understand it, maybe we can then use that to modify our own behavior, if it is something that you want to work on. We work with kids that have issues with some of their social skills, and they're perfectly okay with that. This is probably not something that is going to be a helpful strategy for those kids. But we also have individuals that we work with that desperately want to fit in. At a conference I went to last year, and it was a similar sort of looking at people with autism and some of the interventions, the person doing this talk said that one of her former students had been through therapy all through school and really hadn't made a lot of progress, got out, and as a young adult wanted to have a job, wanted to have friends. And she said she didn't advocate this, but what this adult did is he went and started hanging out at the local bar. And he started watching how people were acting. He started watching what their body language was doing, what their gestures they were using, and was able to start mimicking the behavior of the people that he was watching to make himself actually fit in much better, and was reporting had gotten a job and was able to keep it. And that's a big part with some of our individuals with autism, is just being able to deal with those daily social situations. Temple Grandin's book, I just made my students read a part of it, and she lost her first job because she told the people she thought they were stupid. And she's like, and they were, because they didn't see this, but she now knows that you just can't tell people that they're stupid. So it's that sort of, if we can use this sort of a genre that's already there, and it also it helps you kind of fit in too, if you're doing something that doesn't look very different than what the person sitting beside you on the park bench is also doing. So it's an intervention that can go beyond the clinic room as well. Yes?
I'm the father of a 20-year-old with ADHD.
Okay.
I'm just wondering, because he doesn't read,
Mhm.
so I'm wondering what
Mhm.
But, you know, you would not be a reader, although I did in high school, we read books like, you know, Pictures of Life, The End of a Sign,
Mhm.
you know, stand-up, but he's not really drawn to reading. But, you know, you can watch a film and, you know, what would be the difference in this from, I mean, it's just a story, you
Mhm.
know, and relating to a character.
That is how this research article, and I keep pointing because I actually have it with me, that was how they kind of ended. They think that we need to start looking at other sources of art form to see if there are similar results. Right, as of right now, I don't think there's been a lot done. My students wanted to go in and do one wanted to look at movies and one wanted to look at books, and I said, you guys want to graduate, so let's back up a little bit. Come back for dissertation, we'll talk. But that was what they wanted to look at, and they said that based on what they know about how reading is impacting empathy, they think that it certainly is a viable path to follow. So right now, I don't know. Yes?
Is there a potential disconnect between the mind and the eyes test and the textual nature of fiction? Where you might not be able to tie in the growth in empathy through the pictures?
You could, and that the reading the mind and the eyes is kind of just a snapshot of where they are with empathy. There's some thought that it's not sensitive enough to look at it, and the reading the mind and the eyes is also a little bit more of that cognitive theory of mind and cognitive empathy than the affective. And so the literature is kind of up in the air of, can you affect both of them equally, and what measures do you need to really look at that? So there are other measures of empathy that look at with a little bit more sensitivity, but we didn't use those. But I think they're out there. We had to choose something that was a little bit more open resource. Anything else? Thank you very much for coming.